just want to start by asking, how did this project come about for you guys, and when did this journey start?
Yeah, I mean, so for us, it kind of started about maybe 4 years ago now, I think. We just made our previous film, Notes on Blindness, and it kind of came to us through Passion Pictures, who we were speaking to off the back of our last film, and they'd been having some conversations with Ben Lindbergh, who's a producer on this film, who's known the Chaplin family all his life. In fact, his mother's really good friends with Geraldine Chaplin. And for a long time, he'd been working with the estate and trying to put together a project, a documentary about Chaplin's life and work. So it came to us via Ben. We were, Chaplin fans. We'd seen and loved some of his films, but not obsessives, I wouldn't say. We'd never taken a deep dive into his sort of life and work. So the opportunity to be kind of let loose in the Chaplin archives and kind of take a deep dive into the subject was sort of irresistible to us, and that was the start of a kind of a project that's taken a few years, and we've got very lost along the way, but kind of emerged with this film.
Tackling such an icon in film and comedy, did you guys feel that weight of responsibility? I suppose. Yeah, I mean, a few grey hairs because of it, maybe.
I think there was, initially, I mean, the name Charlie Chaplin just hangs in the kind of ether. Even today, we were struck when we first started talking to people about the project. Just everybody knows the name Charlie Chaplin, even if they've never seen his films, even if they're not familiar with that wild life story of his, the greatest rags to riches story of all time. His biographer tells it, and so we were kind of I wouldn't say slightly daunted by the prospect, but we realized that actually, approaching it, there's hundreds of books written about Chaplin. There's some wonderful, great films, documentary films made about Chaplin. So we quickly, early on, realized that maybe we sort of need to try and share this problem of how do you approach such an icon with the audience, really. And there's some wonderful kind of quotes out there. We start the film with the quote, to enjoy any Charlie Chaplin you have the good fortune to encounter. But there's this sort of mythology and rumors and reports that swirl around him that really are quite kind of tantalizing, and we thought we'd have to try and make a film that kind of reveled in a lot of that, and along the way we might be able to pull out the threads of these multiple versions of both the man and the character.
And would you say that, you mentioned also the producer had that, good relationship with the family. How crucial was that for you guys in terms of, putting this all together and, having that kind of access to footage?
Yeah, well, I mean, we feel so lucky because, the Chaplin estate kind of shared their entire archives with us. And so we were able to draw from his, extraordinary body of work, the 66 films that he made just as The Tramp, as well as the films after that. And, it's a really interesting time to do that because all of those archives have been catalogued over, the previous decades. And so there's such a wealth of extraordinary material to explore. But on top of that, we were also keen, I think, to look for material which hadn't really been used before and hadn't seen. Pete's talked about all these other films and books that have been written about Chaplin. I think we were keen to ask the question, why another film? And for us, doing it rested on the idea of finding new material that could shed some new light on him. And so after kind of, an extensive research period, we were excited to be able to follow leads and track down things that, had been forgotten or lost, including this extraordinary interview we found with Chaplin's childhood friend, Effie Wisdom, who was recorded in the 1980s, talking age 91, I think she was at that point, in this beautiful Cockney accent about Chaplin's childhood, which was this really humble upbringing he had in South London. Chaplin's mother was separated from him at a young age when she was taken to the asylum, and he spent a bit of time in the workhouse as well. And Effie, in this kind of glorious accent, talks about feeling sorry for him, how she describes this attic room that he grew up in, 12 square feet that he was living in with his mother, and the kind of hunger and the poverty that he experienced. And so that was an extraordinary kind of gleaming piece of material that we knew would form a really important part of the film. And so we actually, it's one of three things that we sort of dramatize in the film, along with this interview that Chaplin did in the 1960s. Chaplin didn't really like interviews. He was quite shy and I think sort of self-conscious about how he came across. But this Life magazine reporter, Richard Merriman, managed to get him to sit down for 3 days in the 1960s and talk to him with a tape recorder. And listening to that, we kind of felt transported into Chaplin's home in Switzerland. And we were looking at the photographs that were taken of that interview. There's hundreds of photographs taken by a photographer called Roddy McDowell. And so listening to the recording and looking at those photographs, we felt kind of transported. And so we decided to restage that as well. And that forms another kind of dramatic thread within the film where we use the photographs and the recordings. And we were able to restage that encounter in the same room that the interview took place, actually, in Chaplin's home in Switzerland, which is now the Chaplin Museum. And then finally, a recording from the 1940s of Chaplin releasing his first film without his famous tramp character, Monsieur Verdoux. And at the press conference of that, Chaplin kind of faces the full hostility of the Hollywood press at that time. And some of the journalists accuse him of having stopped being a good comedian since he's been bringing political messages. And so that kind of forms the climax of the film. And these three things are sort of these little dramatic pockets within this huge swirl of archive material and of course clips from Chaplin's films.
What, you mentioned obviously the interviews with with Effie. What else did you guys uncover or maybe discover about Charlie Chaplin during that whole process of making this?
Well, there's an extraordinary amount out there. There's I think for someone who's such an icon for the first, for of course made films in 6 decades of the 20th century, but was really the most famous man in the world for a good couple of decades, really. And that level of celebrity that he had, I think, was extraordinary and struck us very early on. There's this wonderful confluence, really, of his artistry and technology. He came out of vaudeville at the same time that cinema was taking root in America. At the same time, when, of course, you had this great melting pot of cultures, this great wave of immigration that had come into the country, and so Chaplin films were playing to audiences who didn't necessarily share a common language, but because they were silent and because this great silent character was so relatable to people, his films really exploded, and within a few short years, hundreds of millions of people were regularly watching films around the world across 5 continents. So for us, that level of fame was really interesting, and I think something that we were particularly drawn to, and it's not really something from this point of history, more than 100 years later, that you can really compute. There was really only a couple of people. Charlie Chaplin was one, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, whose names aren't so well, these days, were really kind of the first celebrities, and more famous than any king, queen, or emperor, or certainly any performer before them. And that's a magnitude of fame that's almost impossible to recreate these days in the more atomized kind of cultural world that we live in.
Yeah, I certainly think when people think of Charlie Chaplin, they automatically maybe go to likes to Buster Keaton, rather than some of the stars that you were mentioning. When you were working on a project, obviously it's been a project in the making for quite some time. How much of an influence has Chaplin had in your kind of professional career as documentarians and filmmakers?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, because Chaplin was one of the first sort of auteurs of cinema in many ways. When he started making films in 1914, he was making a film a week at Keystone Pictures, just a short film a week, and he was very frustrated with the lack of control that he found in how these sort of improvised films that were kind of very quickly put together. And as soon as his films were successful, he quickly used it to gain greater and greater control of his work. He was soon directing and taking control of the editing. And by the time he was making his feature films, he was writing, directing, editing, producing, scoring, and starring in the films. And kind of exerting total creative control over every aspect of it. He even got involved in the hair and the makeup. When he directs, his actors, he would do this kind of mirror directing thing where he'd be standing just off camera and performing exactly as he wanted them to do the scene, and they would copy him exactly. So everyone on the Chaplin set became a kind of mini Chaplin for him to kind of sculpt and control. But interestingly, in contrast to that total level of kind of control, he also embraced this sort of improvisational way of working, where he would be starting a film without really knowing the full arc of the plot or really how to set up crucial aspects of it. And this is something that he kind of kept secret at the time, because he didn't really want people to think that he didn't know what he was doing. But actually, the films would evolve over the course, in some cases, of several years. You know, in our documentary, we look at, in particular, at City Lights and the making of that. And there's one there's one scene in City Lights which he returns to across several years and over 500 takes. 500 or 300? 314, sorry. Over several years. So I think this interesting kind of marriage between total control and also letting go, sort of surrendering to the process and letting the story kind of evolve naturally over time is really interesting. And I think that does have a kind of a parallel, going back to your question, with kind of making a documentary, where essentially, you know, to some degree, you're trying to examine everything you can. You're trying to look at every angle, but things also take a natural structure through the way that you piece things together. And I think you're constantly having to respond to the structure that presents itself by what you choose to focus on, if that makes any sense.
Could you guys imagine taking on that Charlie Chaplin ethos of starting with a plot and then taking it from there? Is that something that would utterly terrify you guys?
I mean, he described it as sort of putting himself in the labyrinth and trying to find his way out. And I think that's sort of what you're getting at there with the sort of, especially in documentary, maybe, you know, you've got this mass of materials and you need to try and you know, pull out those threads and try things out and embrace happenstance and mistakes and scrap things and restart. And there's no doubt that there's, you know, multiple sort of shadow versions of our film that exist somewhere on hard drives that probably will never see the light of day.
What I quite like is the fact that you guys, you know, cover the more controversial part of his personal life, and you mentioned obviously his life in the media. Was that always at the forefront of your mind when you took the project on, that you were going to be, you know, focusing on that and, you know, giving time to that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there's so many aspects of Chaplin's life that we wanted to explore, but I think we couldn't ignore some of the more complex aspects of his character and the story. And it's interesting, I think, to place that in relation to sort of Chaplin's position as one of the first celebrities in history, you know, because as we've talked about, no one before Chaplin was famous in that way. I think no one before Chaplin had been forging relationships with people across the world through screens. Then also when we come to the 1920s, when his separation from his second wife, Lita Grey, leads to their divorce, that's one of the most scandalous and expensive divorces in Hollywood's history. And I think it's one of the first times that audiences were having to try to make sense of how to reconcile details that they were learning about someone with this kind of relationship that they'd formed with them via a screen. And it's something that, of course, has such resonances with some of the conversations that have been happening in recent years, particularly when we've heard Lita talk about how she felt that people couldn't necessarily reconcile what she was describing with the character that they knew on screen. And also her sense that she didn't necessarily feel like she could get her story out there or be believed at times. Yeah.
And do you find that, you know, surreal in a way that, obviously you're talking about the media coverage of Chaplin back then compared to how, you know, celebrities deal with press and media now, and that it's, you know, not changed massively because you still have that aspect of media coverage?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, you know, I think it was about 100 years ago, someone said about Chaplin, there's more myths, legends, rumors, and beliefs about Chaplin than many a system of religion. And I think Chaplin, in his early days particularly, was keen to sort of explore how he could kind of, I think, play with his own life story as well. Like in some of the early interviews he did, shortly after he became famous, he would sort of have fun with his life story. He said that he was born in France. He claimed that his mother was already dead when she was very much alive, and living in an asylum in South London, or a nursing home by that point. And so, but I think then later on, through his autobiography, and then through things like this Richard Merriman interview, there's this feeling of him kind of solidifying the life story a bit more. And I think his autobiography is an extraordinary thing in that respect, in that he kind of revisits these this sort of almost Dickensian childhood that he experienced, which he was always, I think, returning to throughout his films. And I think it's very moving in a way to trace how, you know, when he builds this vast sort of Hollywood, this vast studio in Hollywood, he kind of uses it to revisit and rebuild the landscapes of his youth. The attic room, for example, that he lived with his mother, where he sort of restages this painful separation, and kind of using the tramp, I suppose, as a way to journey inwards and journey backwards to his past. So in some ways, I feel like Chaplin sort of is always revealing himself to us through the tramp and through his work on screen. But yeah, as you say, he's also subject to this sort of the explosion that celebrity can bring to a sense of self as well. And I think he's always, I think, wrestling with how to almost reconstruct himself in that mode of celebrity experience.
You know, that point you made about him always kind of wanting to go back to his roots, you know, you see that in the Kid. You know, that's what that film essentially is. And just one final question before you guys go. What are you working on at the moment that you're, you know, able to share? What's in the pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, the Chaplin film was a real introduction to us in terms of like working with archive and non-fiction archive, and so we were kind of keen to, I think, follow up that and pursue that. So I'm working on a long form film, which isn't quite at the stage of being able to kind of break to the world, but yeah, another sort of deep dive in archive, that sort of, again, to try and lose myself in that labyrinth, I suppose. Yeah, but we have a number of sort of small short form projects that we're also sort of toying with, and hopefully we'll have some announcements over that in the next sort of 6 months or so.
Sounds exciting. Well, that's all the time I've got. It's been great speaking with you guys, and best of luck with the release. All right.
Thanks for having us.
Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys.
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey You Guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yeah.
Nice.
Hey You Guys!